This week's Parsha is Parshas Lech Lechu. And at the end of the Parsha we learn Mitzvahs Milah. The Rambam, at the end of Hilchas Milah, writes how important, how central, how great this mitzvah is. Kol ha-mitzvah shosu Avraham Avinu lo nikra sholem ad shemal. And if a person is not Mekayim Mitzvahs Milah, doesn't circumcise himself, ein lo chelek li'olam haba. Ve'af al pi kein, if there's any danger, any chashash sakana, any sakana is doicha Mitzvahs Milah. And these are sugis that we learn Shabbos Kuf Lamed Daled Omed Aleph, Yevomis Samach Daled Omed Aleph. The sugin Yevomis we learn Tinik Shemesa Echov Machmas Milah, Ein Mala Noisoi. A child is born, 2 older brothers perished after Milah. Then we don't do Milah to child number 3. Machloikes Rebbe v'Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, 2 brothers or 3 brothers, Trei Zimna hava chazaka o tlad Zimna. By din and forces were Machmer Rebbe. 2 brothers passed away. We don't do Milah to number 3. And it is not only Meso Echov Machmes Milah. If there is any danger to the child's life, as we learn in Shabbos Kuf Lamed Daled, the Milah is postponed. The Rambam brings these halachas Sof Perek Aleph Melchas Milah halacha Yud Zayin and halacha Yud Ches. Halacha Yud Ches is about Tinuk Shemeso Echov Machmes Milah. But in today's Shiur, the more relevant halacha is halacha Yud Zayin. And I'm reading Perek Aleph halacha Yud Zayin. Koten shenimsu b'shmini shelo yoroik b'yoyser ein mala noisat sheyipol boydam. V'chenem hoyo odom b'yoyso ein mala noisat sheyivlo boydam. V'tzorech lizor b'dvorim eila harba. V'ein mala nele yeled she'en bo shum choli. And now comes the punchline. Shesakonis nefoshes doicha es hakoil. ואפשלום לאחר הזמן ואפשר להחזיר נפש אחד מישראל לעולם. The Rambam writes, why do we push off Milah? סכונס נפושס דויכה הכל, ואפשר למול לאחר זמן, ואי אפשר להחזיר נפש אחד מישראל לעולם. You could do Milah at a later stage, in a later time. But if a man will die, we could never bring him back. So l'chayretz mashmen Rambam, if we don't have an opportunity to do Milah later, then we will do it now. It is only because Ef Shalom Aliyachar Zman, and if we know there will be no opportunity Lom Aliyachar Zman, it's not going to get better. He's not going to get better. Things won't change. Then we do it now. Why? Sekonis nefoshes doicha esakol. Milah is not one of Gimel Avedas Chamuris Shebetoira. So the Achronim deal with this Rambam. And I just want to mention a few drochim before I share with you what I think is Pshat in Rambam. Shuvas Chasam Soifa, Yoredesim and Reish Mem Hei. Some Sofer says maybe, according to Reb Shimon ben Menasya. Reb Shimon ben Menasya, Yuma Pei Hei, is the source. How do we know that Pikuach Nefesh Doiche Kol HaTorah Kula? That's the most basic source of the entire Shas. Lahalocha, Shmuel, first generation of Ameroim in Bavel. V'chai behem v'lo shiyomus behem. And it's from this posuk that we know Pikuach Nefesh overrides any mitzvah, besides the big 3. Avodah Zorah, Gili Harayis, v'shvichas damim. Reb Shimon ben Menasya says, V'shamro b'nei Yisrael es Shabbos, lasois es Shabbos, chalol of Shabbos, achas kadei sheyishmo shabosois harba. So the Some Sofer says, according to Reb Shimon ben Menasya, The only justification to be Mechalel Shabbos is to enable this person to keep many more Shabbosim. One Shabbos for other Shabbosim. One bris for another bris. So the Chassam Sofer argues, according to Reb Shimon ben Menashe, it's only if you're mevatel a mitzvah to enhance the observance of the same mitzvah at a greater level and another time. So that is the reasoning, the rationale of the Rambam. We will push off the bris to enable to do the bris at another time, and the child will live many years with ois bris kodesh. Don't do it now, and I'll die in a short while. And that is why the Rambam says, Ef shalom aliyach hazman. But the Chassam Sofer himself says, Haloche kishmuel. It is not from Chalul of Shabbos Achas that we know Pikuach Nefesh Doiche Kol HaTorah Kole. It is V'chai Ben V'Lashiyamas Behem. I also disagree with the Chassam Sofer. Reb Shimon ben Menashe just brings a source to Pikuach Nefesh Doiche Kol HaTorah Kulo. So even if the source would be Chalul of Shabbos Achas Kadesh Yish Meshabos Arba, that is just a Melitza Ba'alma. Chalul of Shabbos Achas Kadesh Yochal Shmor any mitzvah. And even for Chai Sho, we're Mechalel Shabbos. And nobody doubts that. Nobody questions that. About the Drosha Chalul of Shabbos Achas Kadesh Yish Meshabos Asaba, I wrote at great length in Minchas Osha Chumash Shemoisim and Samach. In this short sheet, I don't want to go over what I wrote there. So the Chassam Sofer is not Pshat in Rambam. The Avnei Nezer Shin Chovav has a different mahalach, an interesting one. And he says we're dealing with a sakona rechaika, a danger which is very remote. And when it's not shchicha hezeika, shluche mitzvah einam nizoiken. We could rely that in the merit of the mitzvah, the person will not be endangered. This sugi shlucha mitzvah ein nizoiken appears 3 times in Shas. Psochem daf ches, end of Perakama de Kedushin daf mem, Chulen kuf mem alaf, the very last shtickle Gemara Mesachet Chulen. So in Psochim the Gemara says shchicha hezeika, though we cannot rely on shlucha mitzvah in hezoiken. Kedushin anacholan deloshin is kviya hezeika. And just recently I wrote a tshuva. Is there a difference between shchicha hezeika, kviya hezeika, and one of the perimeters of shchicha hezeika? So the Avnei Nezer writes, it's not shchicha hezeika. It's a remote sakana. And we could rely on shlucha mitzvah in hezoiken. But if you could be mekayim this very same mitzvah without any level of danger, odif tfei. And that is why we wait. We wait. Ef shalomul la'achar zman. But if there's no reason to assume that this danger will pass, ve'ef shalom aliyach zman, we will do it now. And we'll rely shlicha mitzvah in hezoiken because it's not shchicha hezoiken. I disagree with the Avnei Nezer as well, who says it's not shchicha hezoiken. Chazal deal with these very same situations. Tinak Yorek, Tinak Odom. And the Gemara's mashma was a very tangible sakon. And if it's not shchicha hezeika, why are we mevatel mila bismano? Why don't we rely on shlucha mitzvah in hezoiken? How does the Avnei Nezer know that we wait to perform the mitzvah without any sakana? The Avnei Nezer also writes that shlicha mitzvah in hezoiken, only the shliach hamitzvah is protected, but not others. So the father is makayim the mitzvah, but that doesn't give the baby protection. And that is why we wait ad sheyagdil. Ad sheyagdil, he's going to be a gadol and I'll do the mitzvah himself. But the Rambam writes ad sheyagdil ma'at. v'yischazek koichoi. We don't wait till he's going to be a gadol. So shlichim mitzvah in azoikin protects only the person that performs the mitzvah. Then efshalom aliyachar zman. So efshalom aliyachar zman without a sakana. So according to the Avnei Nezer, an adult who is ill and the bris might cause his demise is mechuyev. That's a gewaldige chiddush that has no basis or no source in the Gemara. Shemesh Shmuel was the great son of the Avnei Nezer. After the Avnei Nezer's demise, he was the Rebbe of Sochachev. Parshas Emor, he brings another pshat in the Rambam in the name of his great father. Git nun zayin ki olecho ragno kol hayoyim ze mitzvahs milah. So it's a sakana anyway. If mitzvahs milah is anyway a sakana, and nevertheless we have a chiyuv, so that might be a reason we disregard sakana when it comes to mitzvahs milah. And therefore, if not she'ef shalom aliyachar zman, we would do it now. And we would look away from the sakana. Because anyway, it's a sakana ki olecho ragno kol hayom. I want to add on to the Shemesh Shmuel another point that the Chassam Sofer makes in that very same tshuva, Yoredeis and Mareish Memei. Chassam Sofer writes, based on that same Gemara, Ki olecho ragno kol hayoyim ze mitzvahs milah. By the course of human nature and by medical standards, milah is a sakana for the baby. And it is only a siyata d'shmaya and a shmira de la eilo ki olecho horagno kol hayoyim ze mitzvahs milah. So if it's anyway l'mala mederech hateva, and it's an ace, it's a miracle, that thousands upon thousands, millions of babies throughout the ages have been circumcised, then ein tzvocha berachoi voiseinu, then he could rely on this gula even if there is an additional level of risk, an additional danger, and that is why it is only because efshalom aliyachar zman that we will push off the bris. These are various different drachim that we find in Achrayim. My personal feeling and understanding is this. And I want to explain in three different hedegeshim, emphasis. Lanias daiti, the Rambam is not mechadish halach. Kidarkoi bekoidish. He gives us some additional insight in his profound understanding to understand mitzvahs HaTorah. Why is it sakonas nefashos doicha hakol? Why? Because nothing is final in this world besides death. Nothing is absolute besides death. Maybe yes, maybe no. Even if not, we could fill in with many other mitzvahs and many other ma'asim tovim. Nefesh yis odom yisrael she'ovad i-efshar lahachzira. I just want to make a point. The Rambam writes, "Sakonas nefashos doicha hakol ve'efshar la'amur liyachar zman." He doesn't write mishum she'efshar. He doesn't write mipnei she'efshar. Ve'efshar. Loosely translated, sakonas nefashos overrides everything. And we can do milah liyachar zman, but we can't bring back a man from his grave. However, the Shulchan Aruch, quoting the Rambam, Shin Samach Gimel Sif Aleph, the Lashon of the Shulchan Aruch is she'efshar, not ve'efshar, which seems to be more of an asinas tam of reasoning. But nevertheless, I don't think the Rambam means to be mechadash halacha. It is only because we can do milah liyachar zman. That is why we postponed the milah. If we wouldn't have confidence, she'efshar la'amur liyachar zman, without a sakana, we would put the child's life in jeopardy and do circumcision right now? No, I don't think that's the kavanah of the Rambam. I think the Rambam just means to stress, why is pikuach nefesh so central? And why does it push aside? Why does it override any other mitzvah? Because other mitzvahs, if not today, tomorrow. If not tomorrow, day after tomorrow. Maybe yes, maybe no. But nefesh echad mi Yisrael she'ovad I efshar lahachzira liyolam. I also want to note that the Rambam in this halacha deals with several different scenarios. Tinok shehoyu yoroik biyoisar, shehoyu odom biyoisar. But then the Rambam writes, tzorech lezor bedvorav elu harba, ve'ein malan elo yelad she'ein bo shum choli, shesakonas nafoshes doicha hakal ve'efshal amuli yachar zman. Maybe this reasoning is on the sefer. Ve'ein malan elo yelad she'ein bo shum choli. It's very common that a baby has a minor condition and he's doing well. And the doctors say there's no reason not to do the bris, no reason whatsoever, no danger. And we, the Rabbonim, say no. Chazal are machmir more than the doctors. The doctors say there's no danger, but Chazal teach us you need to wait 7 days. If you had a slight fever, 7 days after it's over. We are more machmir b'mikuach nefesh than the doctors. And I've been saying this for the past 8 months. We need to be machmir more than medical professionals, than the establishment. Establishment has their set of priorities. We should be more stringent than anyone else with a chashash of pikuach nefesh. That's quite obvious by bris milah. So the Rambam writes, Ein moren elo tinoik she'en lo shum choili she'ef shalom aliyach hazman. But my basic feeling is, gam am yef shalom aliyach hazman, sakonas nafoshes doicha hakol. And when the Rambam writes this line, nefesh odem she'oved yef shalach ziroi, I spoke about this 2 weeks ago. The topic of the Shiur was Chamiras Akanta Me'Yisura. And I quoted the Chassam Sofer 2 different sources, on Chul and Daf Tes, and then on the Zohar Daf Lamed. The Chassam Sofer writes, why is Chamiras Akanta Me'Yisura? By Yisura we rely on Roiv, we rely on Svek Sveka, not by Sakana. And the Chassam Sofer writes his own Sfora. I think that's the Rambam. That's the Rambam. The Chassam Sofer writes, because in Issa V'Heter, you're on the safe side. The same HaKadosh Baruch Hu that said you can't be Machal Shabbos said you rely on Svek Sveka. The same HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the same Torah that says you cannot eat Neveres Atreifa says you could rely on Roiv. But if a person will die, you could never bring him back. And that is why Chazal teaches Chamirim Eskanta Misura. And I think that's Pshat in the Rambam. That's Pshat in the Rambam. Shalamul yachar zman. Lav davka mishum shef shalamul yachar zman. The point is, you can never bring back a person that died. And the Chassam Sofer is actually the Rambam. That is the way I would understand the Rambam. So in Yevamah Samach Daled Amud Beis, the Gemara deals with the question, so how many children need to die? 2 or 3. We should assume that is something, some genetical disorder, and we won't circumcise number 3. And the Gemara tells the story about one of the Ameroim that did Mila on a child, even though 2 brothers died, and it was on Shabbos. And Abaye says, you are matir sakanta ve'isura. Rashi explains, you put the child's life in jeopardy, and that's a grave transgression. and you were Mechal Shabbos. Because in Meisei Echov Machmas Mila, it's like Mila Shaloi Bismana is not Doicha Shabbos. This is somewhat of a surprise. Mashma B'divrei Rashi is Mekayim the mitzvah, but it's not Doicha Shabbos. Why is he Mekayim a mitzvah if he puts the child's life in jeopardy? Oinig Yom Tov Simem Emarav deals with the question, a person has an illness and he cannot eat matzah. Matzah might bring about his demise, obviously an allergic reaction or celiac or whatever it is. And the Oinig Yom Tov says, if you perform a mitzvah, putting your life in jeopardy, then it's a bracha levatala because it's not a mitzvah at all. And the Oinig Yom Tov wonders, why does Rashi say it's like Mila Shaloi Bismana? Lani is daiti, and this brings me back to a yesod I explained many times. This Chalamoid I gave a special shiur to yeshiva boys that were in a malonit of corona. And I discussed a great chiddush. Sometimes there is a cheftzeh de mitzvah, but you're not going to get any sechar. Sometimes it's not right to be makayim a mitzvah. Not because it's not a mitzvah. It is a mitzvah, but it's the wrong thing to do. And I brought 3 or 4 examples. One of them is Hayoyse Besukkah B'Shas Yeridas Geshomim. The Oinig Yom Tov wonders, Sukkah Osa B'Anua. If you're not makayim a mitzvah, it's an isser. And I said, but I've seen many Gedolim that sat in the sukkah even though it was raining and pouring. Many years ago, about 45 years ago, I spent in sukkahs in Union City, New Jersey, with my Rebbe, the Kloiser Magarebe Divrei Yatzev. It was raining and pouring, cats and dogs. The rain didn't stop for a moment. It was relentless. And the Tzanzer Rebbe didn't leave his sukkah. And at the Tish, the Hasidim covered their heads with nylon, with plastic bags. Quite a sight. But the Rebbe didn't leave his sukkah. So the Oinig Yom Tov asks, it's also about Noah. What I argued, Hamitztaya potem in a sukkah. You don't have a chiyuv, but it's still a cheftzeh de mitzvah. So why does the Ramah write in Siman Tov Reish Lamed Tes that he gets no sechar? He will get 0 sechar. Maybe he will get punishment. Because Chazal say, Moshe Levet Shemose Koisel Rabbe V'Shofech Lo Kitten Al Ponov. It's a mitzvah, but it's not the right thing to do. Chazal teach us when to perform a mitzvah and when to stay away. I think the same refers to Mila B'Mokem Sakona. It's a mitzvah. But on the other hand, it's an Aveda, and the Aveda overrides the mitzvah. But the fact is, it's Mila B'Yom HaShmini. You're taking off the Orla, it's a mitzvah. It's the wrong thing to do. But if not Mila Shaloi B'Zmana Einoi Doicha Shabbos, we would say, in the Cheftzah, it's a mitzvah and it's Doicha Shabbos. And that's Pshat in Rashi. It cannot be better than Mila Shaloi B'Zmana. Right here and now, you don't have a chiyuv. Not only you don't have a chiyuv, it's an aveira. So it can't be better than Mila Shaloi B'Zmana She'ena Doicha Shabbos. That would be my understanding in Divrei Rashi. And maybe Rashi L'Shitosoi. In Yevot Messiah no Medalav, there's a Machlokes Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Tinuk Shemeisi Achav Machmas Mila. And Mila would put his life in jeopardy. Does he have a din of an orel? Orel also betruma, also b'achilas Pesach. Rabbeinu Tam says he's not an orel. He's not an orel. If he doesn't have the mitzvah's Mila, he has a prohibition to do Mila, then he's not an orel. Rashi writes, factually he has an orla. He's an orel also betruma, also bepesach. Doesn't have the mitzvah, but you cannot deny the fact he's an orel. I think Rashi L'Shitosa, with an additional extension, 1 mile further, Rashi says not only is he an orel not only is he an oral v'osa b'pesach u'betruma, if he does Mila, it's a mitzvah. The Aved is greater than the mitzvah, but it doesn't mean that it isn't a mitzvah. It's the wrong thing to do. But there's a chefza, the mitzvah, and therefore Rashi must explain. Why isn't it Doiches Shabbos? Because Mila Shaloi Bismana is not Doiches Shabbos. And the only Mila that's Doiches Shabbos is Mila B'Yom Shmini when you have a chiyuv to do Mila. That's how I will understand Rashi. And this brings us to a fascinating halachic discussion. A non-Jew shemesa echov machmas Mila, and he very much wants to convert to Yiddishkeit. He very much wants to be lachsois tachas kanfei Shechina. Could he do gerus without Mila? Would we say a woman does gerus without Mila? Tefillah is enough. Maybe the same would apply to him. He cannot do Mila because it endangers his life. So could he become a ger without Mila? Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, Oznayim LeTorah, Parshas Yisroi, tells a story. I was visiting Reb Chaim Moizer. And Reb Chaim Moizer Grudzinski, the Achiezer, told me he just got a sefer and the Mechaber asked for a skoma, and he was very angry. And he told me that Mechaber writes that a goy shemesa echov machmas Mila, we could convert them, we could do gerus without a bris. And Reb Chaim Moizer says, well, he's a nebach, but there is no gerus without Mila. You cannot be a Megayer and Orel. It goes without saying. Rabbi Zalman didn't know who that Mechaber is, but we do. And that Tzitz Eliezer was such a huge book here of Waldenberg, Chelik Tezvav, Siman Aleph. He brings that sefer was Chazoin Lemoyed. I think the name of the Mechaber was Mordechai David Eidelberg, and he was the Rav of a town in Russia. Maybe it's Nikolaev. And in his sefer, he writes that you could do gerus without a bris if the bris would endanger the convert's life. And he writes in the Mafteches at the end of the Sefer Siman Zayin, after the Sefer was already printed, I asked us coming from Reb Chaim Moizer, and he was very disturbed by what I wrote, and therefore I would take it out. So please disregard the psak that I wrote in my Sefer. He was machnia to Reb Chaim Moizer. But before the Sefer Chazoin Lemoyed, 50 years earlier, more than 50 years, Tafreish Yud, we find in another Sefer, Ois Bris, Hagrash Kunitz. He deals with this question as well, and his netiya is that you could be Makayim, that ger, even though it doesn't finalize the discussion. Sridei Yesh Rav Weinberg, Chelek Beis Mesameches, he also discussed this question with Reb Chaim Moizer, and he heard Reb Chaim Moizer's firm opinion. And today we have it in Chelik Dalad Achiyeza, Siman Mem Dalad, and Siman Mem Hey, and Siman Mem Vav. The earliest source dealing with this question is the Bnei Yissaschar and Sefer Derech Pikudecha. So I really wouldn't expect Rabbi Zalman Meltzer or Reb Chaim Moizer or the Sridei Eish to be familiar with the Bnei Yissaschar. It's a pity, why not? But that's the fact. Sefer Derech Pikudecha of the Bnei Yissaschar. Mitzvah Beis. Derech Pikudecha is al Seder HaMitzvahs. The Bnei Yissaschar writes, a non-Jew may say Echov Machmas Mila. And today we know what it is. It is hemophilia. So when you have hemophilia, one of the ingredients, one of the basic particles that cause clotting in blood is missing. So these people could very easily bleed to death. even from a minor wound. Chuvas Baz, we find that Baz says, I once saw a person that had a little cut in his ear and he bled to death and he died. And that Baz was perplexed. That's hemophilia. So, in a situation in which this non-Jew cannot do Mila, he's going to be putting his life in jeopardy. The Bnei Yissaschar, just like the Achiezer and the Sridei Eish, writes, he cannot do Mila. After all, he's a Orel. However, maybe he's entitled to put his life in jeopardy to become a Jew. And I was happy to see the Bnei Yissaschar because this is an argument I wrote many, many years ago. Gimel Averos or Doche Pikuach Nefesh. Would being a Jew be Doche Pikuach Nefesh? It's the entire package. It's everything. It's the Tariag. So it's a paradox. A goy has no chiyuv to do gerus. What a Kodesh Baruch Hu expects from him is Sheva mitzvahs. And then he's Machasida Yom Ezoilam. He has a chelik li'olam haba. He has no chiyuv to do gerus. We ain't missionaries. We won't even try to convince him to come to us. But I still think, if it's his choice, maybe he's entitled even to do it with Mesirus Nefesh. This is a separate discussion. Does a guy, a non-Jew, have an Isser, putting his life in jeopardy? Ma'abed atzmei l'das, taking his life, poshet she'osu. Because the basic source of Ma'abed atzmei l'das is Aches dimchem l'nafshaseicha medish, posek that was given to Noach in last week's parasha. But putting your life in danger is not committing suicide. It's not the same. The prohibition to put your life in danger is v'nishmarta moile nafshaseicha, and that's a posek that was given to Jews and not to non-Jews. It's not Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. So I don't want to speak about this in great length, but my feeling is, if a non-Jew wants to come and to take upon himself all hayahadus, lakonis labris v'lachses tafat krachas kafei shchenu, he is entitled to put his life in danger to do so. Another point I want to make, I bididi talia, and I say this not alocha lamaisa. My feeling would be, if he cannot do mila, he could become a Jew with tefillah bilvad, just like a woman. Lo mebaya l'shitas beinotam, that he doesn't have a din of an oral. He's muta betrumah ve'bepesach. Even according to Rashi, he's also betrumah ve'bepesach. He does have an orla. But a Kodesh Baruch Hu doesn't expect from a convert what he doesn't expect from a Jew. If he would be born Jewish, he would have no chiyuv to do milah, because his life will be in jeopardy. The milah of a ger is the same as milas Yisrael. No, I'm fully aware. Milas Yisrael is not gerus, he was born a Jew. But in essence, it's the same milah. And the Kodesh Baruch Hu says, if you would be born Jewish, you would be circumcised. When you become Jewish, it is as if ani hayom yelideticha. You cannot be a Jew and an orel. You need to do milah. But we won't demand from a ger what we don't demand from a Jewish boy that was born Jewish. It also raises a question, how do we define milah and tefillah, the combination of the both? Are milah and tefillah both the essence of gerus? It is only the combination of the both that is etzem hagerus, or would we say no? Tefillah is gerus, but milah is a condition. We cannot accept you as long as you're an orel. But it's not that the milah is etzem hagerus. If the milah is etzem hagerus together with the tefillah, then Reb Chaim Oizer probably is right. But there's room to argue, Tvila is the gerus. Mila is just a condition, a stipulation. We won't accept you if you don't do Mila. Because Jews do Mila, and if you want to be a Jew, you need to do it as well. If that is the understanding, then I would be Naita. But if a Jew under these same circumstances cannot do Mila, because the Konis Nefoshes Doicha Hakal, the same would apply to a Ger. Who am I to question Reb Chaim Oizer and the Bnei Yissaschar and some others? And therefore, I was so happy to notice in Minchas Soiles Mitzvah Beis, he brings the Bnei Yissaschar and he disagrees. And he writes exactly what I've been arguing. Who was the Minchas Soiles? Reb Tevel Dikler, one of the Gedolim in Galicia. He was murdered in the Shoah. Hashem Yinkom Doma. He was relatively young. The Kloiser Mogarebi was his Talmud Muvak. So the Divrei Yatzu was a Meshamish many Gedolim, most notably Reb Meir Arak, who was the Godel Ador in Turne, the Ostrov Tzerebe, but his Rabbi Muvak was Reb Tevela. And Reb Tevela's name was actually Reb David Tzvi Zeiman, and he was born in Dukla. And he writes, Kvar kusafti b'tshuva, shemi shemeso echov machmas mila could be mesgaya without mila. It's a pity we don't have the tshuva. Probably lost forever, for eternity. But at least I was gratified to see that one Godel at least writes the same as my fundamental feeling was. I also think it's a bit unreasonable that there could be a man in the world that cannot be Mizgaya. This must be a privilege open to everyone. It's not reasonable that a person, for subjective reasons that another he's making, doesn't have the opportunity to come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to be Mizgaya. So I am fully aware on Reish Sameches, the Beis Yosef, and all the Rishonim bring Shittas Rabbeinu Chananel. Goy, Shabuna is Gair Kishu Mohur. Rabbeinu Chananel says we can't do Geras because he can't do Mila. He already did Mila as a Goy. So we can't accept him. But that Shittas Rabbeinu Chananel, most of the Rishonim reject that Shitta totally. And in their opinion, we will do a Tavas Dambris, but he could do Geras, even though he's not really doing a Mila. And a Tavas Dambris is not defined as Mila. Even in the opinion of Rabbeinu Chananel, we find two different signoines. The Beis Yosef writes, we can't accept him because Kilkel B'yatzmai. He destroyed his options. Balaito writes, that is why we reject him. Both reasons are in Shayach when this young man has a medical issue. He did nothing wrong. He wasn't Malavoida Zora. This is the way he was born, and he's a hemophilic. Generally in Geras, I always say, you can't do Geras based on Kulas. We don't want a situation, which I'm just describing B'derech Moshe. We don't want a situation in which a person after 120 years is up there in the heavens and he's patiently waiting in line. Takes some time, and the clerk is sitting behind his glass shield with his computer. And he dictates to everyone where he needs to go. Right to Gan Eden, left to Gehenna. So our friend finally standing right next to the pocket, checks the computer, looks at the screen, and he says, I'm very sorry, but there seems to be some misunderstanding. At the end of the corridor, there's an elevator. 3 flights down, go to your left. That is Chasidei Omesu Oilam, the righteous of the nations. He starts yelling and screaming, you're crazy? I mean, there's a mix-up. You didn't get it right. I was a Satmar Chassid all my life. What do I have to do with Chasidum Olam? The guy looks at a screen again and he says, yes, yeah, you're right. I know you're a Satmar Chassid. But when you were 3 years old, you were converted. And the rabbi that converted you, the Beis Din, they paskin according to the Rambam. But up here, we paskin according to the Ramban. And according to the Ramban, your Gedus is invalid. We don't want that situation. So the pocket tells him, elevator, 3 flights down, go to your left. It's not 5 stars, but it's 4 stars. It's decent, it's nice. That's tragic. And therefore, it is never sensible to make a gerus based on one opinion. The other opinion definitely wouldn't make sense to rely on gerus on the Minchas Osher when he goes against the Achiezer and the Derech Pekudecho, the Bnei Yissaschar. So once the end of the story about Ploini Almoini, I recommended doing gerus by laser, in which there is a minimum of blood of loss. And I think that is what they did. So for further and deeper understanding of this halachic issue, Shalosh Teshuvos Minchas Osher Simen Ayin Ches. So just a week ago I wrote a tshuva about a wonderful young family couple. This is their 3rd baby boy. First 2 boys, they invited a moil, a very chashuv a person. But that chashuv a person doesn't wear a mask. He keeps no social distancing. He belongs to those groups that just disregard corona. And this young couple was very troubled. Do we need to invite him to be the moil because he has a chazakah? He was mal our previous 2 boys, or could we invite someone else? So I dealt with a basic question, is there a chazakah b'mitzvahs? Which is a fascinating sugya, which we won't get into today. But my psak was, don't invite that moil. Even if there is chazakah b'mitzvahs, even a remote pikuach nefesh would override that chazakah. 2 fascinating tshuvas. And before I even share with you the content of those tshuvas, I say, Ein halochik emoisam, that's clear as daylight. But it's interesting and fascinating anyway. Degel Machne Ephraim. When I quote Degel Machne Ephraim, everybody thinks about the Chassidish Sefer. He was an anikel of the Baal Shem Tov, one of the great spokesmen of Chassidus. No, I don't mean him. Degel Machne Ephraim, 250 years ago, Rabbi Ephraim Laniyado, he was the chief rabbi in Syria, in Aram Tzoba. In his Shuvas Yoredei Semen Daled, speaks about a baby that was born in the midst of a Magefa, obviously a cholera outbreak. And the family was afraid to take the moil into their house. So the Degel Machne Ephraim deals with the question, Dever be'ir kaneis raglecho. Chazal say, lock yourself up in your home, but does it also mean don't let anyone in? And the Degel Machne Ephraim says, yes, it means don't let anyone in. Because if you let everybody in, you might as well be outside. So why do Chazal say kaneis raglecho? So he paskins that the father has the right to say, I don't want a moil in my house. I might be infected. I don't want anyone in my house. And we would push off the Mila. The same conclusion is reached by the Moshe HaKoyen, who was the Rav in Jerba, 50 years later, or 60 years later, Tofreish Chov Gimel. He passed away. And in his Sefer, Pnei Moshe Simen Reish Samach Gimel Yoredeya, same reasoning, same conclusion. Don't let anyone into your house, not even the moil, and will be mal at a later stage. As I said before, Ein halochik emoisam. There's no reason to push off Mila. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jewish children were nimoil in the past 8.5 months of the corona outbreak. If you take all the possible precautions, you're not putting anyone's life in danger. And therefore you must do Mila. However, that is if you take the precautions. So inviting someone that totally ignores the rules, I think you shouldn't call that moil. You should take another one that is cautious and diligent and following the rules. So in this week's parasha, we start the Asora Nisyonis Shenesnas Avrom Avinu V'Omed B'Kulam. And these 10 tests, or Nisyonis, cover the entire spectrum of the human experience. All the challenges and difficulties that one could imagine are all included in those 10 tests. Asora Nisyonis Shenas Avrom Avinu V'Omed B'Kulam. Rashi writes, Omed Bekilam V'Lo Hirher Achra Midosav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Meroiv Ahavasoi. Many, many years ago, probably about 50 years ago, 45 years ago, I once heard from my great Rabbi, the Tzanza, the Divrei Yatzev. He lost his wife and 11 children to the Nazis. His oldest son was called Lipala. He survived the Holocaust. And he succumbed, he died from typhus right after the liberation. What a tragedy. And the Tzanzer Rebbe, this great tzaddik, was left alone, ka'arar ba'arava. And I once heard from him, not for one moment did I doubt Kadosh Baruch Hu's judgment. And I remember then when I heard it, a shudder passed through my body. And I feel the same right now every time I quote that. What a tzaddik. Losing a wife and 11 children. And never for one moment questioning a Kadosh Baruch Hu's drachim. That was the greatness of Avraham Avinu. At other opportunities, I explained that those 10 nisyonos of Avraham Avinu was not for him, it was for us. And all the koiches we have in Mesiras Nefesh throughout the ages is only mekoiches shel oisei zokein. And as I mentioned, those 10 tests cover the entire spectrum of human experience. We appreciate the Nes of Ur Kasdim, in which Kadosh Baruch Hu Avraham Avinu puts his life in direct danger. Mesiras Nefesh for Kadosh Baruch Hu. We definitely appreciate the Nesoyan of Akedas Yitzchak, which was the toughest Nesoyan, to kill your own beloved child with your own hands. Es bincho es yechitcho asher ahavta. But what was the Nesoyan of Alech Lechu Mi'artzecha? I think it was a huge Nesoyan. One of the great psychologists expressed a basic axiom in psychology. Man is a social being. Indeed so. Our sages, our Gedolei HaTanoim said, Oy chavruta o mituta, either companionship or death. Yes, man is a social being. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Avraham, Lech lecho, go, pack up and leave. Lech lecho mi'artzecho me'moladetecho me'beis avicho. From easy to hard, mikal el hakoved. By human nature. And I really think it's human nature, beyond social norms. People become attached to their country, to their society, to their friends, to their close circle, and above and beyond anything else, to their family. Millions of people died in all these crazy nationalistic wars. So those are the three circles to which people are attached emotionally, sentimentally. Lech lechu mi'artzecha, leave your country. Moledetecha, your social circle. Moledet in modern language is your country of birth. In our sources, Moledet is your social circle. The people you were born amongst, the friends you grew up with. Leave your country, leave your friends, leave your family. And that is a huge nisayon. To pack up and leave. And Avraham Avinu doesn't know where he's going. Ela oretz asher al eko. That was the nisayon of Lech Lecha. We're in the midst of the COVID pandemic. In a way, we all have the same nisayon of being removed, detached from our most beloved ones, our families, our talmidim, our friends, many of the elders of our communities. I know so many people who for months have been sitting in total isolation in their homes, and their children don't come. Not because they're bad children, because the parents don't want them to come. Because the elderly might be infected by disease. But it's tormenting, and to many it's torture. For months, not to see your kids, your grandchildren, not to hug them, not to kiss them. It's a real nisayon. But we grow from nisyonis. It is what Yiddishkeit is all about. Avraham Avinu was the first Yid. Asora nisyonis. From one test to the other. Every test is a challenge. Every test is an opportunity. And if we rise to the challenge, it's a huge schus. So yes, in a way, it echoes in our ears. So most of us aren't required to leave. Some of us did relatively good accommodations to a malonit for a week or two, or 10 days, or 2.5 weeks. But many really are feeling the pain of this isolation. The elderly, they don't even have the kids to come to visit them. And they're terribly lonely. It's a nisayon, my friends. We grow from nisyonis. I recently spoke to B'nai Torah in one of these Maloniyot Corona. And I quoted the Yerushalmi in Brochas Samaches, because this period is very hard on B'nai Torah. Sitting in capsules, you don't have direct contact with your Rosh Hashivas, with your Rabbeim. Many don't have proper chavrusa. Either he's in isolation or he's sick. And when he comes out of isolation, I go into isolation. It's a tough time for B'nai Torah as well. But the Yerushalmi says in Brochas Samaches, Imru Isu Sabriya Shemes Yaishem and Torah Amoid V'Hachzek Bo V'Atonoit El Secha Kulam Amoid V'Hachzek Bo. So in difficult times, when people struggle, and there ain't that many masmidim, it's an unbelievable schus and opportunity to those that could rise to the challenge. Yalkut Shemoni, Tov Kuf Samaches and Kohelas, on the posuk Afroch Mosi Yamdeli. Torah Shalamadati Ba'af Hisha Amdoli. Torah that I learned out of pain and struggle and difficulty and stress. That is Torah that has special siyata d'shmaya. And let me tell you this. I was sitting weeks and months with my wife, Oleya Shalom, in hospitals. Shari Tzedek in Yerushalayim, Sloan Kettering in New York and Manhattan. And I always had my pen and notebook and some of the most amazing chidushim I wrote in those difficult times. I hope I'll never be back there again, sitting in hospital wards when my wife was suffering. And in those quiet moments, I just was sitting and writing. And some of my greatest chidushim are from that period. Torah Shelamadati Ba'af has very special siyata dishmaya. Rab Baruch Ber, one of the greatest disciples, Talmidim of Reb Chaim Brisker, related this story I once heard from Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim said, when I was a younger man, I went through the Shagisari and the Turei Oven, the two monumental sforim of the same Mechaber. And I came to a conclusion that the Shagisari is better than the Turei Oven, clearer. And why is that? So Reb Chaim said, because he wrote the Shagisari as a younger man when he was desperately poor and he was in great pain and suffering and stress. The Turei Oven he wrote when he was Rav in one of the biggest communities in Europe, in Metz, in times of relative calm, times of plenty, and that is why the Shagisari had more siyata dishmaya than the Turei Oven. So every nisayon is a new opportunity. Every nisayon is a challenge, and we need to rise to that challenge. Lahagdil Torah u'la'adira, ledavko boy. Let's all try to rise to the challenge, like Avraham Avinu did. Sora nisyonis nisasa, va'omad bekuram. We should have siyata dishmaya. We should only hear b'soiris toivus. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send refuas v'yeshuas, and we should zoicha b'korav to bias Moshiach tzidkenu b'mheiro v'yomeinu amen.